He was an original in every way. He had a librarian's legs, an oversized head, wrists thick as pipes, and a moon-shaped face so ugly it was lovable. When he stood in the batter's box, he seemed to have just grown out of the earth, a primitive statue. But when he swung, sweet music played. And when he smiled, he lit up a nation. An incorrigible kid with clout became the Sultan of SWAT. I give you the father of modern baseball, a sports god for the ages, Babe Ruth.
When it was discovered that the 1919 White Sox had thrown the World Series, baseball reached its lowest point in history.
Baseball needs a savior, and he's standing there to save baseball.
But more important, suddenly here's this man hitting more home runs than other teams are hitting.
People didn't trust the game anymore. Now, all of a sudden, into the sunlight, here's this big Rob-a-Lasian character who can do this one thing that nobody has ever really done well before.
His 29 home runs in 1919 was a record. No one ever hit that many before. Next year he went to 54. The long ball became the prime thing in baseball. Ruth led the way and the others followed.
Instead of a infield hit and a stolen base and a sacrifice and a ground out to the right side, now there was an infield hit and wait for Babe to come up and hit one out of the park.
Ruth's heroic efforts and his home run hitting and his popularity brought people back to the ballpark, and nobody questioned whether the game was honest or not because the Babe was hitting home runs and there was nothing you could do to stop that.
He changed the extent of the appeal of baseball for all time. I don't know of anyone in any other sport who as an individual had as much effect on the popularity of the game.
It received a tremendous injection of adrenaline and came back to roaring life on his shoulders primarily.
Every place he went, every field he played on, people came to see this monumental figure. The crowd started cheering as he walked out of the dugout. There was a joy that you had come to see something, and then when you saw it, you'd scream with delight.
There was something different about that man. The minute he walked in a ballpark, people stood up, oh, there's the Babe, there's the Babe.
Either home run or struck out. If he hit a single, double, or triple, he'd get booed. Every time you face him, the butterflies will start flopping around. You think you'd get over it, but you don't.
He projected, he had impact. He didn't hold off the public. He was accessible. They could reach out and touch him.
Hey, listen, you fellas need a ball player?
You mean you want to play?
I play ball.
What's your name?
Babe Ruth.
The Babe lived not 2 blocks from where I did. And my parents would let me go down to the Hotel Alamac where he lived on 71st Street. And one day he saw me and smiled and ran his hands through my hair. And I went running home and nobody was allowed to touch me again.
But as the twilight crept across his towering career, this baseball god was reduced to the status of orphan to a game that had been his only real home for 2 decades. Still, he hung on, face pressed against the window.
He was terribly disappointed when he was not asked to manage the Yankees. He was hurt. He wasn't mad. He was hurt.
We know that Babe wanted to manage a team. He was never given the chance to manage the team. I believe to this day the owners disliked Babe Ruth because he was beyond their control. I think that's their way of getting back at a guy they could not stand.
My mother often said how to be rejected by the one thing that was his being was more than disappointing. He went to such a severe depression that he just didn't want to live anymore.
Born February 6, 1895, to a distracted mother and a hard-working father, George Herman Ruth was at odds with his world almost from the day he took his first steps.
The neighborhood where Babe Ruth grew up in Baltimore was a tough, working-class neighborhood. I don't know if you'd quite call it a slum, but it was a tough neighborhood.
His father was running a bar, and he had absolutely no supervision whatsoever, and he was just running wild.
He used to like to go to Lexington Market and kick over the baskets of vegetables and fruit and infuriate the Italian stall markers, and they would be chasing him down Utah Street.
He was throwing rotten fruit at passing truck drivers. He was swilling the dregs of the beer in his father's saloon.
He was a strong, tough, bullheaded, willful youngster, and he was the despair of his parents.
He was just constantly getting into scrapes. He drank and he smoked, and he was just a young kid, and they just couldn't handle him.
His sister said, "I wish I could have counted the number of times that there was a knock on our door and there'd be a woman with another boy and say, 'Mrs. Ruth, did you see what your boy George did to my Jimmy?'"
His parents wound up putting him into the St. Mary's Industrial School with the hope that it would straighten him out and give him some structure in his life.
Described as a moral hospital that treats maimed souls, the Zavarian Brothers of St. Mary's did not discriminate, applying love in the form of strong corrective measures to any deserving student.
They were kids of all faiths. A lot of them were orphans. They went there, they learned trades to be printers, plumbers, shoemakers.
The goal of the brothers at St. Mary's was to bring out the best in each child. Some were highly delinquent and were involved in committing serious crimes. Other ones were there simply because their parents died and they were truly orphans.
I have to think that God was looking out for him when his father took him to St. Mary's and says, "Here, I can't do anything with him. See what you can do."
The Zavarian brothers were strong disciplinarians. They realized and saw a lot of the good that was in the babe.
The brothers were strict. They didn't mess around because they couldn't. But they loved us and we loved them. The babe was taught by the brothers to read and to write, to know right from wrong, and they realized he needed a trade. They tried to teach him shirt making.
Ruth was saved from the dreary prospect of making shirts by one particular brother who took an interest in him from that day in 1904 when the 9-year-old went to stay behind the walls.
The babe had great admiration and sensitivity toward Brother Matthias, who was a big 250-pound brother, strong on discipline but great sensitivity.
Brother Matthias was legendary with a fungo bat. He would go out in what they call the big yard after dinner each night and take dozens of baseballs and hit them as high as he possibly could. And he hit tremendous clouts, which word has it were only exceeded by the clouts that Ruth hit many years later when he would come back and visit St. Mary's.
Brother Matthias picked him out at St. Mary's and told him that he thought he had the potential for being a baseball player.
When he got to St. Mary's, he discovered that baseball, being better at baseball than anybody else was a way of fitting in.
It was the first thing that he ever felt he could do and be complimented on.
If baseball was Ruth's life raft in a social sea of 800 boys, it also served as a replacement for a mother's love he had never known.
Babe quite sadly would say that his mother never came to visit him during the 12 years that he was at St. Mary's Industrial School.
If it wasn't for the fact that people recognized this skill and harnessed it, he could have been incarcerated by the time he was 18 years old, and America never would have heard the name.
Instead, Ruth made a name primarily as a pitcher in the semi-pro leagues around Baltimore. When he was discharged from St. Mary's at 19, the 6'2", 180-pound left-hander was signed by Jack Dunn, owner and manager of the International League's struggling Baltimore Orioles, for $100 a month.
Babe got the name Babe in that 1914 Oriole training camp. The first thing he did was to buy a bicycle and crashed it, much to the fun of the other Oriole players who were sitting on the porch of the hotel. They said, "Who is that young monkey on a bicycle?" And they said, well, that's Dunn's latest Babe. The Babe had never been on a train. He had never been in a hotel. He had never been in a restaurant. So all these magnificent wonders of the world were opened up to him for the first time.
He was a misbehaved kid. Incorrigible in that sense. Uncontrollable is probably a better word. He didn't know how to do things. He would wear the same underwear day after day after day, and when people kidded him about it, he just stopped wearing underwear, wouldn't wear underwear for years.
He had this wonderful, positive, outgoing personality with a great sense of humor, and I don't think that started when he became a star. I think that was the way he was from his early days.
He had had all these baseball experiences, but never had any experiences dealing with women, and he ended up proposing to the first woman who talked to him for any length of time.
It was almost like allowing an animal that had been restricted for 15, 16 years, let him out into the open and just could run for as long as he wanted.
By July, the talent-laden Orioles were in first place, and Ruth had compiled a 14-6 record. But meager attendance forced Dunn to sell off his stars to the big leagues. And Ruth went to the Boston Red Sox.
Babe Ruth was a hero of the 1916 World Series and a hero of the 1918 World Series. He was 21 years old in 1916, and he was a pitcher.
He was the best left-handed pitcher in the American League. He would have been a Hall of Fame pitcher had he never hit a home run.
In the 4 years that he was a pitcher, he won more games and had a lower earned run average than any pitcher in the American League except Walter Johnson. And he beat Johnson repeatedly in 1-0 games.
In 6 seasons with Boston, Ruth won 89 games and posted a 2.19 ERA. In 1918, he also began hitting homers at an impressive rate, tying for the league lead with 11. This double talent of hitting and pitching posed a dilemma for the Red Sox manager.
Ed Barrow, who later became the Yankee general manager, resisted making him a hitter because he said, they'll string me up alive if I take the greatest pitcher in the American League and make him an outfielder.
Because he was a pitcher, when he tried to hit home runs with more or less every swing, they didn't coach it out of him the way they would have had he been a young hitter.
Ruth, the pitcher, only appeared in 17 games in 1919, winning 9. But his 29 homers caught the collective eye of the Yankee brass.
Harry Frazee, the owner of the Red Sox, was in some financial pickle and needed money. And he started casting around looking for money. And suddenly, down in New York, they came up with the cash and said, we'll give you the money if you'll give us Babe Ruth. The money was there, and he grabbed the money and sent the Babe south. I don't think Boston has recovered ever since.
Babe Ruth would never have been Babe Ruth if he had played out his career in Boston. He would not have been the American cultural figure he was were he not playing on this stage in New York.
In the spring of 1920, Babe slipped into a Yankees uniform just as a seminal decade in American history began. Neither the country nor the game would ever be the same.
He came along in the 1920s. The war was over. The jazz age was upon us. The art of public relations and of ballyhoo, of creating public excitement, had come along with radio. Larger than life in his gargantuan appetites, his prodigious performance on the field, and equally prodigious off the field, Babe Ruth, symbol of the 1920s.
This was a man who wanted it all. This was a man breaking the bonds of this sterile childhood, of this orphanage upbringing, and he was bringing America along with us.
The 20s is the decade that gave us celebrity. This was the New York of Jimmy Walker. It was the New York of Rudolph Valentino. It was the New York of Lindbergh. It was a time of larger-than-life figures, and there was no one who was larger on that magnificent stage than Babe Ruth.
There was something about this convergence of Babe Ruth and the communications revolution of the 1920s that really changed American lives and changed our entire culture.
We had no television, so no one actually saw Babe Ruth unless you went out to the ballpark. So all kinds of things were sort of concocted in the press.
Some members of the press realized that they had a sort of a treasure. He was an instrument that they could use to tell wonderful stories, just as he was a player that the Yankees could use to win ball games.
The golden age that we think of, the 1920s of Runyon and Gallico and Bryce, was in fact an age of myth-making. They were in the business of creating legends. They were like medieval troubadours singing the saga of the joust.
They were the only storytellers, and therefore the whole of what you knew about sport came from these people.
Ruth offered something for every one of them. For Damon Runyon, he was the Broadway figure. For Paul Gallico at the Daily News, he was the New York wise guy standing up to management. And particularly for Grantland Rice, he was the Homeric figure on the field whose exploits lent themselves to these flights of fancy that made Rice's reputation and fashioned the personality of Ruth on the sports pages.
This symbiosis between Ruth and the sports writing fraternity extended outside the lines, where the Babe played freely, without fear of public exposure.
What today's sports writers will not ignore and sometimes go digging out, the writers in the 20s and 30s covered up. And so Ruth's peccadillos were widely known to the writers, but they never wrote about them.
They protected the Babe. I've heard a story that the Babe was chasing this naked woman through the Pullman, and the writers are playing cards. They don't even pay attention.
It was a time of excess in a city of excess. Babe Ruth was welcome and wanted in every restaurant, in every speakeasy, at every party in New York.
You talk about excess, you talk about consumption, and he was Babe Ruth as this absolute example. He's free, he's making more money than he ever dreamed of. So you can just imagine a young man with the normal amount of testosterone, with money in his pocket. He was just having a ball.
The Babe tells the cabbie, he said, "Stop here, wait about 10 to 15 minutes, I'll be right back." He goes up, has a little session with one of his girlfriends, and the cab's waiting. He comes back, gets in, goes to the ballpark.
Ruth did represent a hedonistic ethic, and you might even say he represented a consumer ethic.
I can't remember the name of the writer who once described Ruth's appetite and said, Babe Ruth will eat anything that doesn't eat him.
Babe's gargantuan appetites went unchecked, despite his ill-fated marriage to Helen Woodford.
They were very young when they were married. Ruth was 20 and she was 16. And as Joe Dugan said, she was just a kid, and Ruth got bigger than the president.
Helen probably was just a victim of circumstance. The Babe, he's on the road, running around, and she was a poor girl from New England. His star was on the rise, and he just left her behind.
He wasn't malicious, he wasn't mean to her, he just didn't pay attention to her. When he was with her, he could buy her things, he could buy her jewelry, but then he was off again, and she was lonesome. She was a neglected wife.
That marriage resulted in one child, but as events would later come out, that child was not the child of their union, but the child of one of Babe's flings with another girl.
My mother told me that my grandfather went to California for an exhibition game, and he met a woman named Juanita Jennings. And that woman turned out to be my grandmother. When Juanita came to New York to have the child, Babe literally took the baby from Juanita and gave it to Helen to raise. Juanita Jennings, she was always in my mother's life. And she kept it a secret until 1980, when she told Mom on her deathbed that she was her mother.
The Babe's behavior was sometimes even outrageous to his teammates.
After the ball game,
The showers are off of the main part of the clubhouse where you dress. And I was in there and I was facing the shower head, lathered up with soap. And all of a sudden, in the middle of my back, I felt a degree of hot water that was different than the shower water. And he was urinating in the middle of my back.
Joe Dugan, who was his teammate on the 27 Yankees, said that 4 or 5 of the guys would go out on a little bit of a bender one night, and Dugan the next afternoon would be sitting in the dugout nursing this terrible hangover, and Ruth would just get up and hit a home run.
Ruth made his own rules, and he did think and that he was bigger than baseball, and that no one could stop him from doing what he was doing.
Just as Ruth needed to be controlled by the Brothers of St. Mary's, he also needed and got a serious reality check from Yankees manager Miller Huggins.
Huggins didn't like Ruth, and Ruth didn't like Huggins. Ruth was out of an orphanage with a minimal education. Huggins was just a well-read man, well-educated man, so the two were bound to clash.
After repeated infractions by the Babe, the inevitable clash came on August 29, 1925, when Ruth arrived late for batting practice, following a night in the town.
Miller Huggins confronted him in the clubhouse in St. Louis and told him not to put his uniform on. You were suspended, and Ruth raised hell.
Huggins said, "You're going back to New York, you're suspended until you apologize to the rest of the team publicly."
Ruth stormed out of the clubhouse, said he was going to go see Commissioner Landis, and he stormed to New York to see Jake Rupert. Huggins had the support of the Yankees, and the Yankees backed him all the way.
And so Ruth either had to do what Huggins wanted, or he was going to be barred from playing baseball. You had a reserve clause. He either played for the Yankees or he didn't play at all.
So Ruth finally came down from his temper tantrum, and he went to Huggins and tried to apologize, and Huggins said, "Well, we'll see." And Huggins just let him hang and hang and hang until Ruth finally realized what an apology was, and after that, he was no trouble.
Huggins made Ruth understand that he was part of a team and that the team would not be run by Babe Ruth.
When the dust settled, the Yanks proceeded to win 3 straight pennants and 2 World Series. Meanwhile, a somewhat chastened Ruth was altering the game with his bat. Having hit 54 homers in 1920 and 59 the following season, the Babe reached his zenith in 1927 with 60, more than any other American League team. But the good times were running down. Soon the heady bash that had been the golden age of the 1920s would end as Wall Street stocks plummeted and baseball's lovable man-child played out his final seasons. A subdued America entered the 1930s with a huge hangover and empty pockets. Even Ruth seemed tamed, if not by the times, then by his second wife, Claire Hodgson, who managed him off the field as effectively as Miller Huggins had on the field.
Mother absolutely lived for Daddy. No one, but no one, could ever say one word against him. She wouldn't stand for that from anybody.
With her loyalty to her famous husband unquestioned, Claire had a second side to her nature that sometimes pushed the Babe to the edges of his patience.
My mother often said how Claire was very controlling, and she would pretty much dictate what Babe should wear, what Babe shouldn't wear. He had to sneak around and do what he wanted to do.
I'm very happy to be the wife of one of the greatest ball players that ever lived. And he is one of the greatest ball players that ever lived because he follows his director's instructions by his exercises and a proper diet.
Claire was not this unsophisticated young girl like the first wife. She was a much more sophisticated urban woman.
She'd already been married and had one child of her own, and she was probably the exact opposite of Babe's first wife, Helen. Claire added a lot of structure and discipline to Babe's life.
Beyond harnessing her husband's spending, Claire created a home environment that was less than warm.
Claire would often play favorites. Julia was pushed in the foreground, my mother pushed in the back. My mother would tell me they had like a 3,000 square foot apartment, and she was on the other end from the other bedrooms, disconnected from the family. My mom spent so much time in her room, she said she counted the flowers. She knew how many flowers were on the wall. It didn't make for a happy home life for my mom.
I understand this is your birthday.
Yes, it's my birthday, all right, and I'm getting pretty old, 37 today.
Is that so? Well, you don't look anywhere near that.
Well, no, the wife tells me the same thing, but I'm going down St. Pete now to try to get in trim for a good season.
Wrigley Field, Game 3 of the 1932 World Series.
Here he was in his 19th Major League season. He'd already hit 650 home runs. He was at the end of the rope. The Yankees had beaten the Cubs twice in New York. Now they go to Chicago. Ruth's in the outfield. He messes up a play, lets the Cubs tie the game. So he comes to bat, and the crowd is now all over him.
The Cubs were, ragging him mercilessly from the dugout, and he heard them. After each pitch, Ruth put up one finger, then two fingers.
With 2 strikes on him, he pointed to deep center field, supposedly saying that's where he was going to hit the next pitch.
Well, I did see that, but I think that the reason he put up his finger and it happened to point in the bleachers was because he still had another strike.
Billy Jergis went to his grave believing that the Babe called the shot. And from his perspective, playing shortstop, he believed that he saw the Babe gesture towards the center field flagpole.
The most remarkable part of that was that with all the shouting and the bantering and the yelling going on back and forth, Ruth was able to step in and concentrate and hit that next pitch.
But when he did hit it out there, in a spot that nobody else could hit so far, everybody believed immediately that there was a direct connection.
It just stunned the crowd that in this furor and fight, he hit the ball so hard, no one had ever hit a ball that far before. The fact that he pointed or didn't point doesn't matter a damn. He was challenged by the Cubs, and he stuck it to them.
Isn't it wonderful to wonder whether or not he did it? Isn't it so much better than having a replay from 16 different angles and have had 150 writers asking him about it after the game?
We wanted to believe it because it was Babe Ruth. If it was any other hitter, it would have been dismissed. Suddenly we have this Herculean myth to wrap him in, and so we're not going to let it go.
When your whole life is a series of majestic events, when you do one more, everybody is going to believe it.
By 1933, Ruth was aware that his greatness was draining out of him.
He had gotten heavy, couldn't run the way he did. The aches and pains were there. He would swing and miss a little more often.
By 1934, Ruth had played out his welcome on the Yankees. After several steep salary cuts had reduced his annual take from an all-time high of $80,000 to $35,000, a dispirited Ruth pursued a dream he had for years. He wanted to manage the Yankees.
He didn't get along with Joe McCarthy, the new manager. He wanted to be the Yankee manager himself, and that was never going to happen.
It's possible they remembered back to the difficult times that they had, not only with salaries, but with other types of disputes, and maybe just simply wanted to cut their ties with him.
Spurned by the Yankees, Babe accepted an offer by the Boston Braves in the hope that it would lead to bigger things. Dressed in a Braves uniform, Ruth began the 1935 season with ancient legs and a child's hope.
He knew that his career as a player was nearing an end, but he was desperately reaching out to keep some connection with the game. Ruth always harbored the hope that by signing on with Boston, the Braves, as a player, this could mean a transition to becoming a manager.
He thought he was going to have some administrative or managerial role, and what they really wanted him for was almost a carnival character. I mean, he was a drawing card. That's all he was.
On May 25th, Ruth provided a final flash of his old self by hitting 3 homers against Pittsburgh. He retired a week later.
Ruth wanted to stay in baseball. It was his life. I can't question whether Ruth would make a great manager or not. I have no knowledge of that. My own sense of it is that he would be a lousy manager.
As a player, he had no peer. His 714 home runs and .342 lifetime batting average more than qualified him to be among the first 5 players inducted into the Hall of Fame. Of the 5, all but Ruth had the opportunity to manage in the big leagues.
The owners had no love for him because, among other things, he really skewed the salary scale.
Babe Ruth had a good sense of his own worth. He knew he was a great athlete. He knew that he was bringing in fans through the turnstiles, so there was no reason why he shouldn't be paid for it. He was a pioneer.
I have always believed that they thought that he would raise the salaries of ball players and that he would give the ball players a lot more than they were getting.
His teammates loved him. Why not?
His early carefree, irresponsible days, I think, kind of, stained his reputation to the fact where they said, oh, the Babe, how could he manage a team? He couldn't manage himself.
I don't think anybody wanted to take a chance on him. All those stories that were referred to that the sports writers did not write in the 20s or 30s, the baseball establishment knew. They knew the stories.
Babe Ruth was just too big. And I think that what owner would want to be eclipsed by a manager he couldn't control?
In 1938, Ruth signed as a coach with the Brooklyn Dodgers on the hope that he might one day get his chance to manage. That day never came.
All of his life, he had been in the game. And the idea that you can't manage, you can't remain in baseball, what else is this man going to do? He had no other real interests. He loved the game, he loved the limelight, he loved the excitement of it, and suddenly you're being told you can't do this any longer.
A lot of people ask me if I'd rather be back in baseball. I say I really do. I enjoy the game, and it's my life's blood to play baseball.
And I think his last few years of life were probably very sad ones for him. He was very frustrated. He tried playing golf, he would go to charity events. It was like the wind was taken out of his sails somehow, and he just looked sort of deflated.
In a letter to Yankees GM Larry McPhail at the end of the 1946 season, Ruth simply and touchingly made his case. I feel it would be a fitting and happy climax to my baseball career to manage the club I was so successful with as a player.
When the news came back, Mom said he just put his head in his hands and just cried because everything was gone. And that's when the depression started. And maybe he drank a little more than he should have. And she got a call one day from a friend that said, you better get over to the apartment because Babe won't come out of his room. He was trying to jump, and my mother's banging on the door, of course, pleading with him not to do this. And he did finally open the door. But I know that stuck with Mom forever.
I saw a picture in the paper, and he looked terrible. I called Mother. And I said, Mother, what on earth is the matter with Daddy? And she said, we have no idea. He's going to doctors, and they haven't been able to find anything, but he has splitting, horrendous headaches. They didn't tell him that it was cancer. He didn't know what was the matter with him. He was deluged with cards and letters. Crowds of kids would stand in the street down below the window of his room, and they'd stand there by the hour. He would sign his name, and he'd tell a nurse to give those to the kids that were standing outside.
And a little later, when Connie Mack came to the hospital to visit him the last time, Ruth said, the termites had got me, Mr. Mack. He knew he was dying.
In the spring of 1947, Ruth was given a day at Yankee Stadium.
There's been so many lovely things said about me, and I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to thank everybody. Thank you.
Little more than a year later, a frail Babe would have a second and final opportunity to say goodbye when he helped celebrate the 25th birthday of the ballpark his homers built.
I covered him only once, and that was his last day in a Yankee uniform.
With the help of a male nurse who was with him, Ruth, with difficulty, got undressed and got into his uniform for the last time.
And they said, well, let's go out. You know, it's time to go. And he walked out through the tunnel very slowly.
Coming up the stairs, he was shaky. And Eddie Robinson, our first baseman, grabbed the bat, gave it to Babe to use to steady himself as he walked to home plate.
And finally, Mel Allen said, and now, Babe Ruth. And I wrote that he walked out into that tunnel of noise with which he must have been more familiar than any other living man.
It was really so sad to hear him talk, and I knew he was in such pain that he could hardly stand to be out there.
Then he went back into the dugout, and the male nurse helped him back into the clubhouse, and he sat there, and Joe Dugan came back and said, can I get your drink, Judge? And that's when Ruth said, I'm gone, Joe, I'm gone. And Dugan told me he started crying, and Ruth did too, and that was the end of his life.
It was a sad day in this country. We lost a great man. He was really an idol for the children.
It was just such a tremendous sense of loss. He was so young, 53 years old.
It was probably the greatest farewell, the biggest wake any sports figure at our time had known.
The fact that Babe Ruth could die, the fact that he was mortal, was an extremely sobering thing, and I think it made a lot of people, particularly baseball fans, introspective for a time.
He died in 1948 after the war, after an awful lot of death in this country, after America had begun to realize that the heroes that they had always clung to were as frail and as mortal as anyone. Babe Ruth was a part of the American family.
Wade Hoyt and Joe Dugan came out of the cathedral together, a terribly hot day, and Dugan said, I sure could use a beer. And Hoyt said, so could the Babe, so could the Babe.
Babe Ruth's life is not a failure. It's as dramatic a success story as any you could find in America. There were an awful lot of kids who grew up fatherless, who grew up with the same sort of background, and not a single one of them turned into Babe Ruth.
It was a time when heroes were created from common men. Ruth seemed to embrace it vigorously and to shake every ounce of life out of the 24 hours in a day.
He understood that people came to the ballpark to be entertained. That may be his legacy, that he was the first guy to figure this all out. It was a stage, it was an act. This was Broadway, this was the theater. I think that's why we're talking about Ruth now, in a new millennium.
His legacy is that he is baseball. He is the human symbol of baseball. And I think that's no small legacy.
The Babe left another, less publicized legacy, not in baseball lore, but in the annals of medicine. He was among the first patients to undergo an experimental treatment for his cancer. At first, Ruth showed dramatic improvement, putting back much of the 80 pounds he lost. His progress was so encouraging that his case was read at an International Cancer Congress meeting in St. Louis. But within months, the cancer reclaimed him, and on August 16, 1948, the Babe was gone. For ESPN Classics SportsCentury, I'm Chris Fowler.